All right, ready to dive into some pretty deep philosophical waters.
Always up for a challenge, especially when it comes to a topic as naughty as intergenerational
And
justice.
I know as a philosopher, you're not afraid of a little complexity.
Well, let's face it, philosophy thrives on complexity, and this concept, it really pushes us to the limits of our thinking, about fairness, responsibility, even time itself.
No kidding. We're taking our cue from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this one, their entry on intergenerational justice. So, yeah, buckle up.
Oh, I've got my thinking cap on.
Excellent. Now, let me be clear right off the bat. This isn't about coming up with easy answers. We're not going to wrap this up with a neat little bow.
No, I don't think so.
This is about exploring the very idea of justice between generations, something that philosophers have wrestled with for ages. I mean, just think about it for a second. How can we even begin to be fair to people who don't exist yet?
It's a mind-boggling question, isn't it?
Totally. And then there's the whole issue of past injustices. Like, do those actions have any moral weight today? Do they carry over? So many questions.
So many questions. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, right from the start, they highlight this really crucial point. It might seem obvious at first, but it's so easy to overlook.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
It's the fact that intergenerational relationships are fundamentally different from the relationships we have with people alive at the same time.
Right, okay. But why? I mean, what makes them so different? What sets them apart from, say, my relationship with the barista who makes my coffee every morning, or even my best friend?
Well, think about it. In most of our daily interactions, there's this element of reciprocity, this give and take.
Okay.
We do something for someone, they do something for us.
Right, a back and forth.
Exactly. We can talk, we can exchange ideas, we can argue even, there's a constant feedback loop. But with future generations,
Yeah.
that's just not possible.
Yeah, it's like sending a message in a bottle. You throw it out there, and you have no idea if it'll ever reach anyone or what they'll think if it does.
Perfect analogy. We act and they react, but not in any way that we can really grasp or engage with. It's this one-way street.
And that leads to another huge difference, right? The whole power dynamic.
Oh, absolutely.
The current generation, we're holding all the cards.
You got all the power, yeah.
We're making the decisions that will have lasting consequences. But those future folks, they have absolutely zero say in the matter.
It's like they're completely disenfranchised. No voice, no vote, no way to make their presence felt, in the here and now.
Yeah, it's more than just leaving them a certain amount of resources or a cleaner planet. We're literally shaping the very conditions under which they'll come into existence.
You hit the nail on the head.
Wow.
Our choices today, they don't just impact the quality of life they might experience. They affect how many people will even be born, the kind of world they'll inherit, even who those people will be.
Oh, wow. That is, you think about it, different policies, different social structures, that could lead to an entirely different set of individuals coming into existence.
It's a dizzying thought, right?
It's a heavy thought. It really makes you realize the weight of the decisions we make, even if we're not always aware of it.
And to make things even more challenging, there's the inherent uncertainty of the future. We can make predictions, we can look at trends, but who really knows what's in store? Trying to navigate what's fair to this vast unknown, it's just incredibly complex.
Okay, so we've established that these intergenerational relationships, they're really unlike anything else we experience. But here's the big question, the one that I'm sure is already on our philosopher listeners' mind. If these future people don't even exist yet, can we really owe them anything? Can they even have rights in any meaningful way?
Now you're getting to the heart of it. The concept of rights for future people, that's a real philosophical battleground. There are some common arguments against extending rights to future generations. And maybe the most straightforward one is simply this. They don't exist now, so they can't have rights now.
Yeah, seems pretty logical on the surface. How can you owe something to someone who's not even around to claim it?
It's a compelling point. But this argument, it kind of misses a crucial aspect of intergenerational justice, because it's not about them having those rights this very second. It's about our actions in the present impacting their future rights that will be based on, on the interests that they'll have as human beings.
So it's more about safeguarding the conditions that will allow their future rights to actually exist.
Exactly. It's about protecting the possibility of their future rights. And, another common objection, it centers around this idea of a right to existence. Critics say, well, if we're talking about future people having rights, aren't we saying they have a right to exist? And then they get worried about this slippery slope, like, Does that mean we're obligated to bring as many people into existence as possible?
Yeah, that opens up a whole can of worms about population ethics, doesn't it?
It does. But I think this line of thinking, it kind of misinterprets what we're really talking about here. The kinds of rights we're concerned with, they're not about a right to simply exist. It's more about the rights that come with being human.
Okay.
Things like, a right to subsistence, a right to some basic level of well-being. These are rights that stem from their future needs as people, not a right to actually be brought into being in the first place.
That's an important distinction. Okay, so that addresses that right to exist
Yeah.
issue. But what about the argument that says, well, we can't possibly owe something to someone we don't even know personally?
Right.
We don't know their individual preferences. We don't know their values, their personalities. How can we even think about acting fairly towards a bunch of complete unknowns?
That's where the whole concept of universal human rights comes in. It's about acknowledging this inherent dignity and worth of every human being,
Hmm.
regardless of, who they are, their specific characteristics, or even if we've ever met them face to face.
So it's about recognizing a shared humanity that sort of transcends time and individual identity.
Exactly. Respecting the moral status of all persons, no matter when they happen to exist. But, even if we accept that future people can have rights, there's this other philosophical hurdle we have to grapple with, and it's a big one. It's this thing called the non-identity problem.
Ah, the non-identity problem.
Yeah.
Now, this is where things get really interesting, even for a seasoned philosopher like yourself.
The non-identity problem. A real head-scratcher. This one really makes us question our basic understanding of what it even means to harm someone.
So break it down for me. Why is this such a mind-bender?
Well, the problem arises when you consider that our actions today, they often determine which specific individuals will exist in the future, right? So if we make choices that lead to, let's say, a less than ideal world, how can we really say we've harmed those future people if they wouldn't even exist if we had made different choices? They literally owe their existence to the very actions that we consider harmful.
So it's almost like they should be thanking us for existing, even if the world we've given them isn't exactly a utopia.
That's the paradox, right? It creates this tension between our moral intuition about not burdening future generations and this logical conundrum of how can we actually harm someone by bringing them into existence in the first place?
Yeah, that's a tough one to wrap your head around. How do philosophers even begin to make sense of this?
Well, it all comes down to how we define harm. The way we traditionally understand harm involves comparing a person's actual state to a hypothetical better state.
Right.
But with this non-identity problem, that comparison, it just falls apart because the person wouldn't even exist in that hypothetical better world. We're comparing apples and oranges, or I guess apples and non-existent oranges.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this gets messy.
It gets very messy, and this is where a philosopher named Derek Parfit comes in. He had this idea called the no difference view, and he basically argued that it doesn't actually matter if our choices affect who comes into existence.
Okay.
The reasons for acting morally, for caring about the well-being of future people, they remain the same.
Hold on. So let me get this straight. You're saying that even if we're responsible for creating the very people we might be harming, we still have an obligation to try and make things better for them.
Exactly. That moral imperative, it doesn't just vanish because we're dealing with this really unique set of circumstances.
That's pretty profound. Is there any other way to approach this whole non-identity problem, though?
There is. Another way to look at it is called the threshold conception of harm. And it kind of shifts the focus. So instead of comparing a person to some hypothetical existence, we judge whether their well-being falls below a certain minimum standard, like a threshold for a good life.
So instead of asking if their lives could have been better, we're asking if their lives are at least, good enough.
That's the gist of it. And this approach, it helps us navigate that non-identity problem because we can say, look, regardless of how they came into being, we have a responsibility to make sure their lives meet some basic standard of well-being.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then that brings up another big question. What is that threshold? What are we even aiming for when we talk about a good life for future generations? I mean, how do you even begin to define that?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's led to a whole bunch of different philosophical approaches. One prominent approach is egalitarianism.
Egalitarianism, right? The idea that everyone should be equal. But how does that really work when we're talking about multiple generations? Does it mean we have to make sure everyone, present and future, has the exact same level of well-being? Is that even possible?
Well, That's one way to interpret it, but it does lead to some tricky situations. What if that equal level of well-being is, pretty low?
Yeah.
Is strict equality really what we want if it means everyone across all of time is kind of equally miserable?
Doesn't sound like a very appealing future. So what are the alternatives? How else can we think about this threshold for a good life?
Well, another option is prioritarianism.
Prioritarianism.
Okay.
That rings a bell. Remind me how that one works.
Sure. So instead of shooting for equal well-being across the board, prioritarianism focuses on making things better for those who are worst off, no matter which generation they happen to belong to.
Okay.
So the idea is to give priority to those who are experiencing the most hardship, the most suffering.
That makes sense ethically.
Hmm.
But how do we actually apply that across, huge spans of time? How do you even compare the needs of someone struggling today with someone who might be born centuries from now? It seems almost impossible to weigh those things against each other.
It's definitely a challenge. Prioritarianism forces us to really think about what it means to be the worst off in different historical contexts and in all these potential future scenarios. It makes us grapple with questions of, relative deprivation and how we even measure suffering across time.
So egalitarianism and prioritarianism, they both come with their own sets of complexities. Are there other philosophical frameworks we can consider?
Yeah, there's also sufficientarianism.
Sufficientarianism. No, that one sounds familiar. Isn't that the one about making sure everyone has enough to live a decent life?
That's the one.
Like a kind of baseline level of well-being?
Exactly. So sufficientarianism, it's all about setting up this minimum standard, this sufficiency threshold, if you will, as kind of the main goal of intergenerational justice. The idea is that once everyone's above that threshold, then, justice has been served, even if there are still some inequalities above that line.
Okay, that seems a lot more realistic than trying to achieve perfect equality, especially when you think about these massive timescales. But I'm curious, what are we actually measuring when we talk about the sufficiency threshold?
Yeah.
Is it just about, basic needs like food, shelter, healthcare, or are we talking about something broader like opportunities for personal growth, access to education, those kinds of things?
That's a great question, and one that, as a philosopher, I bet you've thought about a lot. It's not just about the quantity of well-being, but also the quality, the kind of well-being we're striving for. It really gets to the core of what it means to live a good life. And how do you translate that into, concrete things that we can apply across generations?
Yeah, it really makes you think about the essence of a flourishing life, doesn't it?
It does, and different philosophical camps, they've come up with different ways to measure it. Some, like you mentioned, they focus on those basic needs, making sure everyone has the essentials for survival. Others, they put more emphasis on capabilities. Do people have the freedom and the resources to actually pursue different life goals? Can they exercise their agency?
Mm.
And then there are those who prioritize preference satisfaction. Like, can people live in accordance with their values, their desires?
Well, it's not just about providing stuff. It's about creating a world where future generations have the actual freedom to create their own paths, right?
Exactly. And this leads to some really interesting discussions about which capabilities or preferences we should really prioritize. For example, do we owe it to future generations to preserve a bunch of different cultures and languages? Should we prioritize things like access to nature or technological advancement? These are the kinds of questions that make us really think deeply about the values we want to pass on through time.
It really highlights how intergenerational justice goes way beyond just like dividing up resources fairly. It's about creating a future that's both just and meaningful.
You said it. It's about building a world where future generations can not only survive, but actually thrive. But so far, we've mostly been focusing on our duties to the future, right? What about the past? What about the injustices that have already happened? Do those have any moral claim on us today?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that whole non-identity problem, doesn't it? Just this time, we're looking at it in reverse. I mean, if those past injustices led to different people existing, can we really say that they were harmed in a way that demands some kind of, I don't know, redress?
Yeah, it challenges those traditional ideas about harm and responsibility, for sure.
So are we off the hook then? Can we just say, well, that was then, this is now, let's just worry about the future?
Not so fast. Even though the non-identity problem makes things complicated, there are still some really strong arguments for acknowledging and addressing those past wrongs.
I'm all ears. How do we reconcile these two seemingly conflicting ideas?
Well, one way is through this idea of surviving duties.
Surviving duties. Sounds kind of spooky, like some kind of obligation that's like haunting us from beyond the grave.
Uh-huh. It's not quite that dramatic. It's basically the idea that certain obligations, they stick around even after the person who held the original right is gone.
So, like, if I promise a friend to take care of their kid if something happens to them, and then, something does happen, that promise, it doesn't just disappear. It still holds, even though my friend isn't around anymore.
Exactly. The duty survives the person. And if we apply that to intergenerational justice, well, even though the victims of past injustices might not be with us anymore, the duties that came from those injustices, they can still exist. And they might be owed to their descendants or even to society as a whole.
Okay, so it's like we're honoring the moral claims of the past, even if the people
Yeah.
who were actually wronged aren't here to speak for themselves.
Exactly. It's recognizing that the past doesn't just vanish. It shapes the present, and it carries this moral weight.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But how do we actually address these surviving duties? What does that look like in practical terms?
It can take different forms. Sometimes it might mean material reparations, a way to acknowledge the economic harm that was done to past generations. Other times it might be apologies, public commemorations. Those can offer a kind of symbolic compensation, right? Recognizing the suffering and the injustice that occurred. And then there are things like truth and reconciliation commissions, which can help uncover the full extent of what happened in the past and provide a space for healing and, holding people accountable.
So it's more than just righting a wrong. It's about acknowledging how history still affects us today, how it shapes our reality.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that we inherit more than just, physical things from the past. We inherit a moral legacy, too. And with that legacy comes responsibility.
This whole deep dive is really making me rethink my whole relationship with time. It's not just this straight line moving forward. It's more like this intricate web of experiences and obligations that are all connected.
I'm glad to hear it. And that's exactly what makes intergenerational justice such a rich and fascinating area to explore.
Speaking of rich and fascinating, we can't talk about intergenerational justice without bringing up one of the biggest names in political philosophy, right? John Rawls.
Oh, yes. Rawls. He's a giant in this field.
He's the one who came up with the veil of ignorance, right? That thought experiment where you imagine yourself designing a society without knowing what position you'd end up in. A way to ensure fairness within a generation.
That's the one. But Rawls didn't stop there. He went on to apply his thinking to justice between generations, too.
Now, that's thinking big.
Yeah.
So how did Rawls approach this challenge?
Well, he argued that we shouldn't just focus on avoiding harm to future generations. We should actively try to leave them a world that's at least as good as the one we inherited, and hopefully even better. He called this the just savings principle.
Just savings principle. So does that mean we should all be stashing away cash for our great-great-grandchildren?
Not quite. It's about more than just financial savings. It's about building up a store of, well, not just money, but knowledge, institutions, resources, all the things that allow future generations to flourish.
So it's about creating this legacy of well-being, like a foundation that future generations can build on.
Exactly. It's realizing that we're not just beneficiaries of the past, but also stewards of the future. We have a duty to not just take, but to give back to this, this ongoing chain of reciprocity between generations.
I like that. It really changes how we see ourselves, not just inheritors, but active participants in this multi-generational project.
And what's interesting? Rawls thought this just savings principle could be justified if you imagined like a hypothetical agreement between representatives from different generations.
So like a time-traveling town hall meeting where everyone gets to weigh in?
Something like that. He pictured the scenario where people from each generation are negotiating a savings principle, but they don't know which generation they'll end up belonging to. It's a way to make sure the agreement is fair no matter when you're born.
That's a clever way to think about it. Takes our own temporal biases out of the equation.
Exactly. It's brilliant, really. But as thought-provoking as Rawls' just savings principle is, it definitely raises some questions. Like, how do we actually balance the needs of the present with the needs of the future? What kinds of sacrifices are we morally obligated to make for the sake of, those who come after us? And how do we make those decisions when the future is so uncertain?
Big questions that every generation has to wrestle with.
Definitely no easy answers. And that's part of what makes intergenerational justice such a challenging, but also incredibly important area of philosophy, wouldn't you agree?
I definitely would. And you know what? I think our philosopher listeners right there with us, realizing that we've just barely scratched the surface of this huge topic.
Oh, for sure. Intergenerational justice, it makes us confront not just these practical dilemmas, but really fundamental questions about our relationship with time, our duties to others, even what harm itself really means.
You know, speaking of harm, one question that I keep coming back to is this. Can we actually harm future generations, even if they benefit from the very actions that cause that harm?
That's a really good question. And it highlights this important difference between harming someone and just making them worse off. Like we talked about before, the traditional idea of harm involves comparing a person's actual state to, to how they would have been if that harmful thing hadn't happened.
Right, but that comparison, it gets kind of tricky when we're dealing with future generations because a lot of times their very existence depends on the choices we make today. It's like trying to untangle a knot that's woven into the fabric of time itself.
Exactly. And so even if we can't definitively say that those future generations are worse off because of what we did, because they wouldn't exist otherwise, we can still argue that those actions were harmful.
Hmm.
We can use that threshold conception of harm that we discussed earlier.
Oh, right. So we're back to that idea of a minimum standard of well-being. So even if future generations benefit in some ways, we've still harmed them if their well-being falls below that crucial baseline.
Precisely. It's not just about, weighing the good and the bad. Even if there are some benefits, we still have a duty to make sure that their well-being doesn't dip below that critical level.
That's a really interesting way to look at it, and I bet our philosopher listener is appreciating that nuance. It shows how the ethics of intergenerational justice, it's not just a simple cost-benefit analysis, it's much more than that. We have to consider the whole range of impacts, the positive and the negative, that our actions have on those future folks.
I completely agree. It really underscores how important it is to be thoughtful about the kind of world we're creating. It's not enough to just avoid the really bad stuff like, nuclear war or a climate
Mm.
catastrophe. We have a responsibility to aim for a future where all generations, present and future, can not just survive, but really flourish.
That's a tall order.
Yeah.
But it's inspiring, too. As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm just in awe of the sheer scope of intergenerational justice. It touches on so many different aspects of being human, our relationship with the environment, how we understand morality, even the nature of time itself.
It really does. And it's something that we need to keep thinking about, keep discussing. There might not be easy answers, but just the act of grappling with these questions can help us make better, more ethical choices today.
Well said. You know, we've covered so much ground in this exploration, from the philosophical underpinnings of intergenerational justice to the very real challenges of balancing the needs of the present and the future. But if there's one thing I hope our philosopher listener takes away from all of this, it's that the choices we make today, they have a ripple effect. They have lasting consequences for those who will come after us. We owe it to them to act with foresight, with compassion, and with a deep respect for their well-being.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And maybe we can leave our listener with one final thought-provoking question to ponder. If we acknowledge that we have these surviving duties to past generations, could future generations have those same kinds of duties toward us? What kind of legacy do we want to leave? A legacy of responsibility, of progress,
Mm.
of shared humanity.
Now, those are questions worth thinking about. And I think they're the perfect way to end our deep dive into the world of intergenerational justice. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.